Mr. Speaker, 10 days ago, before dawn, life changed for me, for my family, for my city, for my electorate, my province, and I think probably our country. Our story is not unfamiliar and not unusual. We were thrown around in our bed, managed to get downstairs with our daughter, crouched under our dining table and waited for the aftershocks to subside. As light came through, the scale of the damage became apparent: a slash a metre deep, half a metre wide across our backyard, a chimney through our bathroom, only metres away from where we've been sleeping, damage across the house. And that's not unusual across Christchurch or Canterbury. Many people have been through it. Many people are in much worse situations than us. My first thought after we got out was, my poor sister in Wellington. If it's this big in Christchurch, how big is it in Wellington? I called her and was reassured to know that, in fact, while they'd felt it, Wellington had not been damaged. The damage across my electorate of Christchurch Central has been well featured in media, and much of that has been on the CBD, which of course is hard hit. But I'd like to just first talk a little bit more about some other parts of the electorate. St Albans, where we've lost several community shopping centres. Our community centre has lost a wall and may be facing demolition. The Coptic Christian Church on Edgware Road has lost its entire facade, both at the church and the community hall behind it. In Avonside, which is probably the hardest hit part of my electorate, it is like a war zone. Many houses have been abandoned. When I wandered through on Monday, talking to people, a chap took me and showed me his pristine house, neat as a pin, but basically its back had been broken by the quake. There was a huge jagged slash through his backyard, and his heart was broken. He'd lived in that house since a boy, since 1963. The good news was, out in the street, a dozen or more students and other young people from Rolleston were out there moving the sand with the spades, wheelbarrows, and by the time I came back to Avonside a day or two later with more volunteers who'd rung me begging for work, all of Avonside, all of the sand had been moved out onto the street and carted away by the council. That's an indication of how rapidly some of the recovery efforts swung into action. In Avonside and other parts, it's been sometimes harrowing to hear the stories. Men of a certain age don't often burst into tears, but that's happened more than once as I've taken my caravan out to try and provide a base to give advice to constituents who've been affected by the quake. Stories coming through about houses broken in half, about people with no water, no power. But I have to acknowledge the response of the emergency services. The restoration of water and power was truly remarkable. Really, by the end of the first week, just about everybody was back on, and given the scale of the emergency, that is quite a truly, truly remarkable achievement. You know, there was a poll quite recently which acknowledged that New Zealanders were amongst the most generous people on the planet, and I think that the last 10 days in Christchurch and Canterbury has been absolutely underscoring of that. When you look at the students, when you look at the turnouts at the welfare centres, staffed by volunteers, locals, yes, but a Red Cross crew that I bumped into at the Linwood Welfare Centre was from Whangarei. Others had come from Timaru, from Nelson, from Blenheim. There was St John from all over the city and beyond. Government departments had staff there providing advice on accommodation, on welfare, on trauma and stress. They've all done an amazing job, and I think we need to acknowledge just what a generous people we are. It's been truly impressive to see how quickly that swung into action and the depth of it and the support that people have provided to other New Zealanders. I wanted to talk for a moment about liquefaction, which is a new word that everybody now has discovered, and which probably 10 days ago most of us wouldn't have known exactly what it meant. I'd acknowledge a very good report. Aaron would know, yeah. Liquefaction, a very good summary done by ECAN a couple of years ago, and one of the things that this report from ECAN said was the fact that liquefaction has the potential to strike just about anywhere across Christchurch. Very dependent, in fact, on the level of groundwater, and we've had a very wet winter, so in fact we paid a heavier price than we might have because of the fact that it's been a very, very wet winter. I would sort of say also, though, that we need to be careful when we start talking about suburbs and potentially not rebuilding, because given the fact that much of the city is subject to potential liquefaction other than the good rock of Port Hills, and of course much of New Zealand, if we think about it. Many of our cities are built on the coast, on the river fringes, which seems to be the most at risk from liquefaction. So I think that rather begins to dissipate any notion that we won't be rebuilding in most areas of Christchurch, because liquefaction is nothing particularly new. It's been there, and there are building techniques that can deal with the worst parts of it, so there's certainly no case for abandoning suburbs. And I think there is a message in all of this for every New Zealander. We are all at some risk from earthquakes. We all need to prepare. Every family needs to have a plan, a civil defence kit, some stored fresh water and food. And I say that as somebody who grew up in Wellington and then moved to Marlborough, which are rather more quake-prone areas, one thought, than Christchurch. And I think we now know that a quake can strike anywhere at any time. And I think we've also shown over the last 10 days that given the nature of our buildings, our building codes, the regulation we have in place, we can come through these things with absolutely minimal, if any, loss of life, as we've shown, because we are so much better prepared than many nations are for these things. In the CBD part of my electorate, it is the heritage buildings that very much make our city. And extraordinarily, not a lot has been done, and I'm talking pre-quake, to protect them. Much of what's been badly damaged by last weekend's quake and the aftershocks since have been those turn of the 19th, 20th century, unreinforced brick buildings, double-storey and sometimes higher. And yet some of the more iconic buildings have come through extraordinarily well. I think of our cathedral, which seems to have come through without much damage. And I thought until last night that our iconic arts centre had come through pretty lightly, but at a meeting I was at last night, Dr. Ian Lockhead, one of our eminent architectural lecturers, said he thought with a suck of the thumb figure that in fact the damage there might be $10 million on that one site alone. And I think that rather illustrates some of the challenges we are going to face in the CBD of Christchurch Central. The Arts Centre Chair, Ken Franklin, at another meeting last night identified 25 buildings, just 25, and there are many more of those heritage buildings across the CBD that were assessed quite recently, and the estimate was that it would be the thick end of $1 million each to earthquake strengthen those buildings, and that is of course not counting any repairs. So we are going to have to take stock of some of our damaged infrastructure. We are going to have to decide what can be saved, what needs to be saved, what must be saved, and make some decisions around that. And obviously this legislation is assisting in facilitation with that. And I guess my big question is if we are going to replace buildings, which of course we are going to do in many instances, what are we going to do to ensure that those buildings that go in to replace those wonderful heritage buildings which cannot be saved, are we going to do it with some style, with some grace, with some sympathy to what's been lost? And I think that's an important challenge ahead of us as a parliament, as a region and city. This legislation is about the rebuilding in infrastructure terms, but of course there are many other issues that we face. We've got issues around the jobs. There's been a commendable bipartisan effort by unions and employers in Canterbury. That's been wonderful to see, and I think we need to acknowledge how well they've been working together. It's an example to us in this House that they have worked so darn well. I just want to finish by saying that my mother went through the Blitz in Liverpool, and I now feel like I have some understanding of what she went through. Of course, that city was rebuilt, sometimes not in the best fashion, I'd have to acknowledge, and certainly, of course, the scale of damage was much bigger than what Christchurch faced. But we now have the chance to rebuild our city. Let's get the support of New Zealanders. We will come through that. The best thing, as my colleague Ruth Dyson said, is New Zealanders can now plan a holiday in Christchurch The city is almost all operational, apart from the occasional building sites. We would like you to come and visit and pay respects to our city, enjoy yourselves, and know that this city that shines, Christchurch, the city that shines,